countries will be the leading
history,
economies,
on
and
contemporary
we will
China
be
and U.S.
working
China
a lot
relations.
with them
As a historian, I do
kinds of
think there
economic
are valuable
investments and
insights
initiatives
into
and so
the
on.
present to
So
be
that's
learned from
essentially
studying history.
where the concept
It's
started.
especially
And in the
important
early
to
days,
study
BRICS was more
not
like an
only what
investment club
historical
where
actors
these
may have
countries were coming
said, but what they
together,
actually
sharing
did.
best
A
practices,
famous
and
example of this
presenting their
is the
best foot
1792
forward as a
statement
group
made by the
to
Qianlong
Western
Emperor to the
capital and
envoys
saying that
sent
we are
from
attractive
Britain,
destinations
to
for
the
investments.
effect
All
that
of
the
that
Qing
changed
Empire was
by around
self-sufficient and
2009,
had no interest
2010.
in
This is
foreign
around the
trade.
time when
Now that
China,
was taken to
after
mean
the global
that
financial
China
crisis,
preferred to
was
continue its
pulling
supposed closed-off
its dollars from
existence.
U.S.
But
treasuries
even a casual
and
observer
moving
could have
them
told you that
to
that
developing
was not
countries
what
through
was
the Belt and
happening
Road
on the
Initiative.
ground.
Even if the BRI was
Already
not
by then,
formally announced
China
at
was
that time,
tightly knit
we
into
saw
the
the
global
biggest
economy,
increases in China's
importing
outward
masses of
development
silver from the
financing
New
in the
World,
years 2009,
as well as
10, and
crops
11.
like
This
sweet
is also the
potatoes
time
and
when South
corn
Africa
that
was
contributed
included
to
in this
China's
club. And
long-term
so that's
demographic
when it
growth.
really became
And many
a
people
block
from the
of
top on
countries or a
down were
group of
absolutely
countries. And then in
interested
2014,
in
they
British
decided to
manufactures, from
make it
wool
even
to
more
weaponry.
formal by introducing
This
the idea of a
misapprehension
new development
became
bank.
the story
And
that
since
got
then,
told,
every year we are
and
seeing
as the
new
basis of the
initiatives.
Western
And I think the
understanding of China over the
2023
next
summit that
100
we
or
just
so
saw in
years.
September of
At
this
a
year
minimum, it
will
caused a lot of problems.
be the coming of
In
a
the
new
same
era
way,
in the evolution
when
of
in the
BRICS, because it has certainly
mid-1970s,
gone from being
China
a group of
launched
these 5
reform and opening
emerging
up,
economies
many
into
people
something
in the
much
West
larger with
took it
bigger
as given
ambitions.
that
And all you have to
economic
do is read
reform
the
would lead
transcript of the
to
speech
political
that
change and
President
the
Xi of
advent
China
of
made,
democracy in China.
on this
And they
summit,
based their
and it is very
interactions
clear
on
that
that
they are
assumption.
looking
But it didn't
at this
happen,
as
and
a
it probably
tool
wasn't ever going to happen.
to compete
My
against the
point is a
United
twofold
States
one.
and to
The
put
first
a
being
face
that you have
against
to
what
see
they
what's actually
consider
happening,
as hegemony
and
of the
relatedly,
United States
that
of
you
the
have to be
global
very clear
system.
that your assessment is based on the reality on the ground and not drawn from the tendency we all have to define others in contrast with oneself. In other words, to understand China on its own terms and not simply in terms of not or not yet like us.
Why are so few Americans studying in China today, and what are the long-term implications of this trend for the U.S.?
COVID wreaked havoc in this context in 2 key ways. First, as regards travel restrictions, in that it became extraordinarily difficult to get a flight between the US and China. And then there were quarantine requirements which had to be met. China's COVID control efforts also included tracking and isolating close contacts of positive COVID cases, which created an atmosphere of uncertainty. I was in and out of China a fair amount during the past 3 years, the COVID years, and there's no doubt one had to adapt to those measures. But on the other hand, for an extended period, while COVID was running wild in some other countries and teaching was wholly online, in China until late 2021, there were relatively few outbreaks and universities were able to teach in person or in hybrid form. In the United States, the widespread promotion of anti-Chinese sentiment made a lot of students, and especially their parents, very anxious, not just about COVID restrictions, but also about having anything to do with China. These factors combined to reduce drastically the number of students in China, but now the numbers of foreign students are starting to go back up, and that has to be a good thing. It is absolutely key that Americans, especially young Americans, become familiar with China and the Chinese people, and that they see for themselves how much as human beings we have in common. And the only way to do that is by coming here to China to see for yourself and not relying on the often highly misleading accounts of others who don't actually have any first-hand information. And the presence of Americans in China enables Chinese people who might otherwise become prejudiced against them to get to know and appreciate young Americans and to grasp that in the end we are all quite similar. From my perspective as the provost of a research university, a major long-term implication of these changes is a slow decoupling of Chinese and American intellectual life, with fewer and fewer cross-border collaborations because of mutual suspicions on the part of the respective governments. And that is bad for the scientific research on which human progress and human flourishing is predicated, as well as for the kinds of cooperation that are increasingly needed today in areas such as climate change, air pollution, health information, earthquake prediction, those kinds of things.
What role do NYU Shanghai and other American educational initiatives play in post-COVID China?
NYU Shanghai was the first of several American joint ventures in higher education in China, each of which is slightly different in its structure and its goals. Our particular mission is to train young people from around the world to master the skills of cross-cultural effectiveness in a community where half are from China and half are from elsewhere. That mission is at least as important post-COVID as it was before. I mean, COVID hasn't changed that. Globalization has not come to an abrupt end, and with the information and communications revolution, it isn't likely to do so. Our students learn how to handle themselves when they're outside their comfort zone and don't automatically know all the cultural reference. They learn how to interact respectfully with people whose assumptions about life may be totally different from their own. They learn how to navigate situations where they aren't sure if they just inadvertently insulted someone or someone insulted them, intentionally or not. They learn how to disagree with civility, and they learn how to see the society and culture that they're familiar with through the eyes of others. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of these experiences and these skills on an individual level, on a national level, and on a global level.
What role do you think education and academic exchanges play in fostering mutual understanding and cultural appreciation between China and the rest of the world?
Well, obviously, I'm a strong believer in the transformative power of education. Academic exchanges are vitally important because you really can't understand another country and its people without spending time there. It's not enough to read about it or to visit for a week. You really need to immerse yourself in another society and culture to get a sense of what makes it tick, to appreciate it, and I think also to learn to appreciate your own society and culture in a more profound way. This is true whether we're talking about the United States and China or any other different cultures. On top of that, for American students to have the opportunity to study side by side with Chinese students cannot help but foster greater understanding. And it is when that understanding is lacking that conflict can arise. Ignorance is not bliss at all. It's a state of mind that too often leads to antipathy or worse. Education and academic exchanges are a small but critically important way to address that risk, and I cannot recommend it highly enough.
How has the decreasing number of internationals in Beijing changed the culture of the city?
Well, I think anytime you have a city that wants to be a global city, and a city like Beijing that has professed a desire to be identified as a global city, a lot of that requires an international community. We think about the great global cities around the world. We think of London, Toronto, even a city like Tokyo, which does not have a huge foreign population as a percentage, but has a lot of people living there from other countries generally. They help to create a very vibrant and diverse, environment for a city. They organize things, they open up businesses, they bring their own culture, their own ideas, and they make a city a much more interesting place to live. A city like Beijing, where you've had such a sharp decline in the number of people living there from other parts of the world, you feel it. You feel as you walk around the street, and you also lose the experience of interacting on a regular basis, if you're a resident of that city, with people from other parts of the world. And I feel like when that happens, you lose a window into what's happening globally as well.
Why is people-to-people exchange important in educational settings?
I'm a big believer in people-to-people contacts being so crucial, for helping to foster understanding between different countries, particularly at a time like right now between the U.S. and China. As fewer students from the United States are going to China, they're missing out an opportunity to realize that China is much more than the headlines, much more even than a government. There's a lot of ideas, there's a lot of vibrant culture there that exists kind of below the level of these geopolitical static that's been going on right now. And not to take away from these issues, they're really important things happening in international relations, but without the students being there on the ground to see the totality of what China's like, I worry about what's the next generation of leadership in the United States on China going to look like? Who's going to be the person who's going to be working for the State Department, helping other people, helping our government to understand China, if we don't have more people getting that initial experience as an undergraduate, as graduate students, being there, learning the language, more than just learning the language in a classroom, learning the language by hanging out with people that they meet.
What role do you think education and academic exchanges play in fostering mutual understanding and cultural appreciation between China and the rest of the world?
Sure. I think this goes both ways. I think it's great to see the large number of Chinese students who continue to follow their educational dreams in other countries. And when those students, many of whom do return to China, they do so with a perspective on the rest of the world that's different from the students who never got that opportunity. It's true too with the students who want to go to China. One of the things I try to talk about often is that it's important to try to understand a place, not necessarily agree with everything you see, but to understand why things are the way they are, understand why people think the way they do. That doesn't mean you're going to convert your ideology. Doesn't mean you're going to change your whole worldview. Maybe that happens. If it does, that's great. But at the same time, that's not the goal of these kind of exchanges. The goal of these kind of exchanges is to hear that other perspective. It's to hear those other voices. Often when we live in a big country, whether it's China or the United States, we grow up surrounded by people who, diverse as the United States is, generally think a certain way on a lot of things, surprisingly. And when we go to a place like China, we realize, wow, that maybe there's a whole different way of looking at this. It's an experience that's not only important for fostering good relations between the countries, it's a transformative experience that I think just makes us, a better citizen of the world.
What is biotechnology? How does it relate to artificial intelligence?
At the most basic level, biotechnology is a science-driven industry that employs molecular biology and biological processes to create new technological applications. These applications include everything from new drugs and medical therapeutics, like gene therapies and mRNA vaccines, to higher yield climate change resistant seeds and new biomaterials. It is a transdisciplinary endeavor that encompasses fields like genomics, bioinformatics, genetic engineering, crop science, and even material science. And it often employs techniques like gene editing and genetic modification, amongst countless others, as its tools. Given that biology and medicine have entered the so-called big data era, AI and biotechnology have become increasingly entwined in recent years. To create precision medicine, for instance, we have to be able to identify the genetic signaling cascades at the root of different diseases. Doing this often requires compiling and manipulating data sets on the scale of tens of millions of genetic samples. Similarly, as we start to understand different diseases on a genetic and molecular level, we have to be able to efficiently identify potential drug targets and design drugs and delivery systems to be able to interact with these targets. AI and machine learning are being employed in all of these processes in both the US and China. For instance, just a couple of weeks ago, a Hong Kong-based company called InSilico started conducting phase 2 trials for the world's first AI discovered and designed drug to be trialed in humans. It's a drug for pulmonary fibrosis. They're currently starting with trials in China and hope to expand to the US in the next year or so.
Is there possible collaboration in the biotech AI field between the US and China?
The short answer is yes, but it's getting much more difficult. Biotech has been increasingly politicized and securitized in both the US and China as of late, but simultaneously, it remains an intrinsically transnational industry. Separating American from Chinese biotechnology is not as easy as one might think. Speaking as an ethnographer, I can tell you that at the level of individual researchers and entrepreneurs across the US-China divide, these individuals know each other really well. They went to grad school together. They go to the same conferences. They trade postdocs and grad students back and forth. They socialize together. When they start companies, they do so with their former classmates, or they put their former dissertation advisor on their scientific advisory committee. This is particularly true given the fact that the majority of entrepreneurs in China's biotech industry right now are returnees. Given these dynamics, nationality is often not particularly salient in terms of the lived experience of the industry. Moreover, when it comes to firms, many firms are born global, which isn't particularly surprising given their founders' biographies. By born global, I mean that from the onset, these firms adopt business models that hinge on operating in and leveraging differences between the American and Chinese R&D ecosystems. Moreover, when it comes to forming collaborative partnerships or engaging in cross-licensing agreements, firms are generally looking for complementary services, expertise, and intellectual property, irrespective of their partner's nationality. Consequently, there's been a number of collaborative partnerships between American and US firms at the nexus of biotechnology and AI in recent years. For example, just a few weeks ago, American pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly just signed a $250 million collaborative partnership with Chinese startup XLPi. Per this agreement, XLPi will use their AI-driven algorithms to identify potential drug candidates, and then Eli Lilly will shepherd these candidates through the clinical trial and commercial development process. Another example from the past year or so would be Arbor Biotechnologies, a startup based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that specializes on using machine learning and AI to identify new nucleases capable of gene editing, partnering with Edigene, a Beijing-based Chinese biotech company that specializes in translating gene-edited technologies into new ex vivo therapeutics. Collectively, these two firms are working to develop new ex vivo cell therapies for various forms of cancer. Suffice it to say that R&D partnerships between the US and China are absolutely possible in biotech and can play an integral role in advancing science and medicine. Concurrently, however, collaboration is getting increasingly harder. In both the US and China, biotechnology has become increasingly viewed exclusively through the lens of national security. On the American side, the FBI's China Initiative and the NIH's recent investigations into researchers' ties to China have left American researchers leery of engaging with their Chinese peers. Similarly, ongoing talk of increased export controls and capital controls have left a number of American firms reticent to invest in or engage in collaborations with their Chinese counterparts. On the Chinese side, the government's recent regulations on the management of human genetic resources have made it exceedingly difficult for Chinese researchers in the biological sciences to partner with their international peers. Moreover, there's also been discussion within the Chinese government of potentially banning the export of gene editing technologies. Ultimately, the over-securitization of biotechnology will not only hold back innovation globally, it also might actually hurt both the US's and China's innovation capacity. The nature of competition in biotech and AI is different than, for instance, semiconductors. There's not as big a first mover advantage. Rather, to stay competitive in biotech, you need to stay engaged with your competitors, not wall yourself off from them. It's a bit of the academic mode of competition. You don't, try to separate yourself from your competitors. Rather, you try to get on panels with them. You trade postdocs with them. You might even invite them for a kind of passive aggressive coffee at the end of a conference. The idea is that even if they beat you to the punch the first time, if you keep up with the cutting edge and stay abreast of what everyone else is doing, chances are you'll be able to beat your competitor to the punch the next time. Also, when it comes to technologies like biotech, particularly when we're talking about new technologies like gene editing, we are all more secure when we know what one another are doing than when we don't.
Why is biotech an important field for both countries to invest in?
At its core, most research and development in biotechnology is about curing diseases and feeding people. While clearly my own research interests lead me to be a bit biased, I would be hard-pressed to identify another high-tech industry that is more directly entwined with the future well-being of both the American and Chinese population than one that's centered on things like eradicating suffering from genetic disease and creating new crops capable of resisting climate change. Clearly, both countries need to be investing heavily in this field. We all need to be investing in advancing these kinds of technologies, as these problems are shared globally. While competition can absolutely catalyze innovation, we can't let notions of national technological competitiveness stymie the advancement of science. When we improve our understanding, for instance, of the mechanisms behind different forms of cancer, or develop a new gene therapy for something like Batten disease, humanity benefits, regardless of from where this innovation emerges.
Hi, my name is Jeff Ding. I'm an assistant professor of political science at George Washington University. On the side, I publish a newsletter called China AI, which features translations of Chinese language writing on AI-related topics.
What is the public perception towards the AI rivalry between the United States and China?
I think there are two main points to highlight here. One of the main public perceptions is that AI has become a central front of great power competition between the US and China. And I do think there's a lot of historical precedent for this. historically, the rise and fall of great powers has generally proceeded from a period of significant technological change, which then creates an opportunity for one great power to sustain economic growth at higher levels than its rivals. And then eventually that great power converts a sustained growth advantage into geopolitical and military influence. And we've seen that play out throughout the centuries with the first industrial revolution and inventions like the steam engine and innovations in cotton textiles that propelled Britain to global leadership, followed by the US's rise in the late 19th century off the back of innovations in electricity, chemicals, and machine tools. And even in the competition between the US and Japan in the 1980s, where many predicted that Japan's dominance of new innovations in semiconductors and consumer electronics would lead to Japan becoming the #1 power on the global stage. So I think that public perception is right on. Another key perception and key assumption about US-China rivalry in AI is that China is either ahead or very close to overtaking the US in terms of leadership in this cutting-edge technological domain. In the next section, I'll talk about why I think that public perception is flawed and the reasons why it is flawed.
What is China's current stage in the AI race right now?
So in terms of China's current stage in this competition over AI, and remember from the first question, I emphasized how the core stage or a core step in terms of great power competition in these emerging technologies is how they affect each country's ability to sustain economic growth. And so where China sits in terms of being able to leverage AI to improve productivity across the entire economy, because that's what's so incredible about these general purpose technologies like AI and electricity. Where China sits, I think, is very far behind the US. And I think the US has a clear leadership position in terms of being able to capitalize on AI to sustain productivity growth. I think we see that in terms of cutting edge innovations like new large language models such as OpenAI's ChatGPT, where there is still a significant gap between ChatGPT and models like Baidu's ERNIE bot that are trying to catch up in this space. And I think this links back to this historical tendency of the US to overinflate and overstate their technological rivals' capabilities in new technologies. I think another factor that points to sustained US leadership is the US's dominance of some of these foundational building blocks of AI development, such as the hardware that is used to train and run algorithms, and also the foundational open source software, much of which is developed in the United States. One point I want to emphasize is oftentimes when we compare China and the US in terms of AI capabilities, we overly focus on innovation capacity. And we neglect this idea of diffusion capacity, which I highlighted in a recent article for the Review of International Political Economy. And diffusion capacity refers to a country's ability to spread and embed new technological advances throughout a wide range of productive processes in its economy. And in recent testimony to the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission, I highlighted why China still is far behind the US in terms of its diffusion capacity. We see that with China lagging behind other countries in terms of adopting information and communication technologies like cloud computing and even computers for business usage. I think we oftentimes ignore the fact that beyond the most developed clusters like Beijing, once you get into the third and fourth tier cities and even farther below and beyond the coastal areas, the diffusion of these digital technologies is still very, very slow in China. And in my testimony, I show how these slow diffusion trends seem to also apply to AI.
What is the Chinese perspective on the risks of AI?
What I want to underline is that Chinese actors definitely grapple with risks and fears about AI development, similar to a lot of different institutions in the West. And I think this is an area for continued collaboration. One thing that I oftentimes have to remind myself as we're bombarded by news of just an increasingly conflictual relationship is that cooperation is happening all the time, and it is happening in this space. For example, there is a joint technical committee of two of the most important international standard-setting organizations that is working on setting technical standards for AI development that have some bearing on controlling and checking against the dangers of AI. And Chinese stakeholders, Chinese company participants, Chinese government participants are very much involved in these standard setting efforts. For example, in that joint technical committee, Chinese stakeholders and representatives lead a working group on the controllability of automated systems. So that's an area where you have people on the ground working together to cooperate on these issues. I think one very interesting aspect of all of this is US decision makers and US thinkers have pointed to the need to find a permissive action link for AI. And what that permissive action link refers to is a technology that guards against unauthorized use of nuclear weapons. It was an electronic lock system that would ensure that a nuclear bomb could not be detonated without express approvals. And the US, even amidst the fiercest geopolitical rivalry with the Soviet Union during the heart of the Cold War, the US still found ways to try to share information and cooperate with the Soviet Union on this permissive action link technology. And so I think it's a positive sign that US decision makers are looking for areas where it would make sense for both sides, even as they compete as rivals, where it would make sense for them to cooperate to control the dangers of powerful technologies, whether that be nuclear weapons or transformative AI systems.
Does India view China as a partner, competitor, or a strategic threat?
In the Indian mind, all of those things are true. Of course, I mean, the relationship, particularly since 2020, when there was a fracas at a place called Galwan, and Indian lives were lost and some Chinese lives were lost. I mean, since then, the relationship has entered a kind of freeze, both metaphorically and diplomatically and militarily. So I think it's fair to say that the relationship is not in great shape. India insists that there can't be business as usual with China, until the Chinese pull out of areas that they came into in 2020, and some other incursions since then, which haven't been quite as dramatic. But there hasn't been much of a movement backwards by the Chinese. There have been some retractions of forces, but not to the extent of the status quo ante. So I think that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I think it's fair to say that neither government has overreacted, and the Indian government has been quite markedly, significantly, cautious. It's insisting that the Chinese pull out forces, but in fact, there's quite a lot of business as usual as well. And in fact, last year, bilateral trade between India and China was the highest ever. After a couple of years of a downturn, partly due to COVID, partly due to the fracas at Galwan, trade resumed to the highest level ever. So there's that degree of normalness. The two have embassies that are functioning normally between the two countries. The leaderships have met at least, at the foreign minister and other level on the sidelines of minilateral or multilateral meetings. Modi has shaken hands with Xi Jinping at one of those. There hasn't been a great interchange at the highest level, but India clearly is not ready for that until there's progress on the border issue. So I think things are fraught and cold, but they're not likely to blow up into something really untoward and unmanageable. I think both sides have been careful to continue some dialogue, continue normal interactions where they can, in the minilateral, multilateral, and trading areas. And that's where it is.
What was the main motivation for Prime Minister Modi's recent visit to the United States?
In terms of, the recent visit of Modi, it's very clear that China is what drives India and the United States together. It's not the convergence of political values so much, whatever the two leaderships might have said, and especially whatever Mr. Modi might have said about democracy in common. Nobody takes that seriously, frankly. And it's not such a massive economic relationship, although at about 180 or 90 billion dollars bilateral trade, India has peaked with America as well in terms of trade. But it's really the strategic challenge, common strategic challenge of China. They won't say it openly, but of course everyone recognizes it, and so does Beijing. And the interesting thing is that it's probably Delhi that insists that China is not mentioned in the various statements, public or more private. Even at the height of the Galwan fracas with the Chinese, even as India received a certain amount of intelligence and some equipment for high mountain warfare and so on that it needed, it didn't possess, which it got from the United States. New Delhi made it very clear at that point that it didn't want, very overt American statements of support for India, because that might, polarize the situation even more. So, oddly, it's India, which is in the front lines with China, which is very, very cautious about, a joint statement with the Americans over China. Look at India's behavior in the Quad and in the Indo-Pacific. I think it's widely acknowledged that India is the weak link there, that it tends to water down any suggestion that this is a common front against China. And it's only after Galwan, for instance, that India agreed to higher level meetings of officials in those two forums. Before that, India tended to downplay both the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. So Delhi is very, very cautious about offending China.
What hesitations does India have about its relationship with the United States?
Look at the way that S. Jaishankar, India's foreign minister, has spoken about Western countries, including the American media, not so much the American government, but about the American media, over any criticism in the West, over two things. One, India's stand on the Ukraine war. India won't even call it a war. It's with the Russians on that. And the second issue is, of course, democracy, human rights, liberalism. So any criticism in the West, either at the official level or Jaishankar is brutal about it. At the same time, he makes no statements about Russia or China of any kind of criticism of their behavior, even though, particularly with China, there's a real problem. All he's saying is to Beijing is get out of our territory, and that's about all he will ever say. So, and I think before everyone gets carried away about the United States and India's partners, India's fundamental international outlook is much closer to that of Russia and China than it is to the United States. And let me give you an instance. If you look at the February 4th statement of Putin and Xi Jinping, which was about 3 weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine, that statement contains implied and direct criticism of the existing world order backed by the United States, liberal internationalism, that whole package of things. There's nothing there that New Delhi would be uncomfortable with in that statement, except for the one criticism that did bite India, and that was the criticism of the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. That India would be a little unhappy about, in that statement, but otherwise it would be happy to associate itself with pushback against liberal internationalism, against making democracy a big deal or human rights a big deal, the domination of the West of international institutions, the need for multipolarity, multilateralism. I mean, that's all bread and butter stuff for India. All the dog whistles that Indian foreign policy is associated with. So no quarrel with the Russians and Chinese over that. The quarrel is with Western dominance and Western policies on human rights and democracy. So, I don't want to exaggerate this convergence with the United States. And I think it's very, very apparent, if you look carefully at statements and behavior on the Indian side. I think it's fair to say that even before Narendra Modi, India used to push back and was uncomfortable about any criticism of its domestic politics. So, it's not new with Modi. It's just much more pugnacious in terms of the response to these things. I mean, you just have to look at Foreign Minister Jaishankar's behavior over the last few months, last year or so. I mean, he's become India's wolf warrior in effect, But yes, I mean, a lot depends on how the Americans handle it as well. In the visit with Biden just now, clearly Biden underplayed the human rights democracy angle. And, America has a history of squaring these circles. Look at Saudi Arabia and the relationship with the Saudis. When they were East Asian countries, such as South Korea back in the day before democracy broke out, they worked very carefully and easily with the South Koreans. America has a whole history of working with illiberal dictatorial countries when it suits its strategic interests. Pakistan, for instance, other Middle Eastern countries, countries in Latin America, and so on. So I think, when we say America, of course, there are all kinds of different constituencies and players. Congressmen may have a slightly different point of view, some congressmen. The American media has a different perspective. Think tanks and so on might say something contradictory to the government. But the White House and the leadership of national security and foreign policy have to be attentive to making partnerships, even if political values differ. And I think, at the end of the day, it's very clear that the China problem is so severe, or is thought to be, for both the Americans and Indians, that they will find a way to, despite the tensions over political values, to do business together.
How much is concern about China driving the United States to strengthen its relationship with India?
No one now has too many illusions in the United States about India being a liberal country. But, I think the issue really is that India's size means that it's the only country around the world, and certainly in Asia, that if its economics finally kind of takes off, that it's the only one that can be a counterpoint to China in the long run. So, the United States and India are united by the idea that even though they may not be allies in a formal sense, or even very deep military partners, what this relationship is really about now is what the United States has done with other partners in the past, including China, in the second half of the Cold War, which is start to transfer technology and develop a series of economic links and develop other capacities in a putative partner, so that that partner, becomes an economic powerhouse, a technological player as well, and therefore develops its own economic and military capabilities in the long term. So that, in effect, India would become an existential balancer against China. It doesn't have to be a balancer in league with the Americans. Its own natural rivalry with China will put it in the forefront of being a balancer. The Chinese will always have to, look sideways to the West at India as India grows. And if the Americans can help India grow economically, then that's mission achieved. Then the natural rivalry and balancing between China and India will play to their advantage. So what the Americans want above all is for India to take care of business by itself, really, in a sense, with some help, become an economic force, military force, and not go over to the Chinese side. I mean, that's the nightmare scenario. That India doesn't remain more or less, kind of neutral to soft tilt towards the United States, but actually goes the other way, that would be a problem for Washington. So the issue is not to sign up India necessarily to a grand alliance, but to build it into an existential balancer against China, and make sure it doesn't go over to the other side. I mean, I think that would be the extent of American calculations.
What would it take for India-China relations to improve?
What would it take for India and China to become closer and maybe even switch sides, for India to switch sides? I mean, I did point out earlier that fundamentally, India's view of a preferred world order does incline towards Russian and Chinese preferences much more than, say, American. So, I mean, I don't want to exaggerate that point, because even Russia and China buy into many of the fundamentals of the existing order, but there are certain elements that they don't agree with, particularly the liberalism of the current order. And that's where India falls out as well. So, I mean, I think if I was in Beijing, I would be cultivating India against the liberalness of this current order. That could help flip India. Of course, a Chinese withdrawal to positions before their Galwan incursion would make it much easier for Delhi to flip sides. And so I think if Xi Jinping wanted to make a gesture that would be really meaningful, he could come to a quick bargain over at least those incursions. Thirdly, of course, if the Chinese were in a mood to compromise much more ambitiously over a final settlement of the border, that could be a complete game changer, because that will take away the main structural problem, one of the main structural problems between India and China. There's always a structural problem at the level of the power rivalry. So even if you took away the border problem, these two big countries would still be eyeing each other a little bit in terms of their power dynamics. But at least that huge historical sediment would go away. And there'd be a very real possibility that India could be flipped. So I think those are at least three things that China could do. I mean, China has shown that it's not above making some of these very big kinds of decisions when it's in its interest to do so, and when it has a supreme leader who feels he has the capacity and flexibility to do so. Is she quite, a Deng Xiaoping or a Mao? I think there's a view that he's that powerful. I myself am a bit skeptical. For one reason, my skepticism really rests on the issue of not so much Xi Jinping, but Chinese society, which is with social media and all of that. There is something like public opinion out there in China that I think even Xi has to be very careful about. And a lot of it is focused on, recovering the homeland and not giving away territory. So pressure on Xi Jinping to do something about Taiwan, Hong Kong, which I guess now is accomplished, and then the really other outstanding problem is the border with India. That chunk of land, at least in Chinese eyes, is even larger than Taiwan. So, I think much as Xi Jinping might be able to pull off an ambitious deal, he certainly would have resistance in the system to it. It's not I don't think there's much India can do to really make a dramatic breakthrough in the relationship. Mr. Modi is not strong enough to do that at home. Xi Jinping is stronger, but even he faces a problem. So, overall, I would say that, I don't think Washington needs to worry too much. But there is one thing that's, that Washington should be aware of. I mean, if American criticism of India on human rights, liberalism, democracy becomes, more extreme, then, you could see Delhi being pushed into the China-Russia camp. So I think, that's where Washington has to take, a call, has to play it very carefully. And if there's a US-China rapprochement of some kind, then things will become very fluid. Or would India then try to pally up to the United States, or would it then find itself reaching out more to China so that it's not dealt out of the game completely? So I think there are dynamic scenarios that and possibilities, but everything points to a situation still where China and India are not going to be very good friends.
Could India pose a military threat to China along the India-China border?
Well, I don't think there's any possibility of that, frankly. India doesn't have the ability to project that kind of military force in Arunachal Pradesh or Ladakh. It can hold the Chinese, at least for the foreseeable future, particularly in Arunachal Pradesh, probably, where geography helps it. The mountains, terrain, and so on makes it difficult for the Chinese as well. But in Ladakh, where the ingress areas are much flatter, it could be much more difficult. But the long and the short of it is that India simply does not have the capacity to project force into Tibet from either in the eastern sector, which is Arunachal, or in the western sector, which is Ladakh. So I don't see any possibility of India kind of like opening up a front against China opportunistically to recover what it sees as rightful territories. And by the way, India is very cautious about how much territory it's actually lost. And nor will it open up another front to help the Americans and the Japanese out and the Taiwanese out in a fight against the Chinese. But in any case, I mean, I think regardless of all of that, Indian behavior, the Chinese have enough deterrent capability in Tibet to deal with virtually any Indian attack. So even at a time when they might be fighting on another front.
How likely is it that India would help the United States in the event of US-China military conflict?
The idea that India might open up another front for its own reasons or to help out the Americans and so on is quite a fantastical idea. It's just not in the realm of possibility. Nor is it very credible that India would open up a maritime front against the Chinese and sort of intercept Chinese ships in the Straits of Malacca and so on. I mean, at least a couple of reasons for that. One are Indian naval limitations and the strength of the Chinese, but and that includes Indian air power. But the other is, I mean, if there's a full-fledged conflict in the Taiwan Straits and extending into areas such as the South China Sea, which is adjacent to the Malacca Strait, I mean, it's the American Navy, perhaps with its allies, the Japanese and the Australians, who are going to stop the Chinese, either in and around the Malacca Strait. I don't think they need the Indian Navy very much. The Americans will take care of business there if they can. And as for commercial traffic, being stopped, well, what commercial traffic would want to go into the South China Sea and into the Taiwan Straits when there's a war going on? So, I mean, the idea that the Indian Navy would be there to keep the straits open or to choke off, say, Chinese shippers that are carrying stuff back to China. I don't think any Chinese commercial shipping will be heading to the South China Sea or the Straits when there's a war going on. Yeah. So I just don't see this idea of the Indian Navy being a factor in the Bay of Bengal up to the Malacca Straits. And certainly the Indian Navy can't project much power beyond the Straits of Malacca. It's a non-factor. And the Indian Navy says it publicly. It has no ability to project force beyond the Malacca Strait. So, I think India is simply not a factor in a Taiwan fight. I mean, at best, because there's a logistical agreement and various other intelligence agreements with the Americans, if Washington, activates those during a fight with China over Taiwan, India will have to make a decision, Now, one of the things that hasn't been picked up in the Modi-Blinken joint communique or statement after the visit is that, there's a couple of lines in there about how India will serve as a hub to service American warships and so on, should they need that facility. So that's a possibility that the Americans will call on India to honor that agreement and to, furnish maybe a certain amount of intelligence. Although, to be frank, the Americans have such enormous worldwide intelligence capabilities that I'm not sure that India can add much. It was the Americans who gave India intelligence on the Galwan incursion that India itself didn't have. And that's right there on India's border. The Americans knew more than the Indians knew, perhaps. So I think even this idea that India would play much of an intelligence sharing role in a Taiwan fight seems to me, looking for something, some sort of peanut butter to put on the sandwich. But at best, I think, some American ships coming back from the theater or proceeding to the South China Sea might need rest and recreation, or stop off, some servicing and and repair and maintenance. That'll be a decision point for India. I wouldn't bet on India saying yes.
How have Indian opinions toward the United States changed over time?
Indian opinion on America has changed, and just in the wake of the Modi visit, a poll from yesterday shows that 65% of Indians are quite favorably disposed towards the United States. But this is soft opinion. It could change very, very rapidly under the pressure of events. What is still true is that because of the colonial era and the Cold War, there's a lot of anti-Americanism in India, even now, just below the surface. And if you look at Twitter commentary, for instance, during the first weeks and months of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, there's so much anti-Americanism and anti-Westernism on display there in Indian elite commentary. It was all America's fault, NATO expansion, sympathy for Putin and Russia, which are India's great friends going back, to the Cold War and so on and so forth. And by God, the Americans were going to be taught a lesson, and America is a country in decline. I mean, just unsupported, kind of opinion and commentariat type of stuff. But, it's revealing that at an elite level and at some popular level, there are very mixed views of the United States. And by the way, that's true in the current Indian government. I mean, please don't imagine that, Mr. Modi and his government all love the United States. Just look at the Barack Obama made a couple of remarks about India's, treatment of minorities, and just look at the pushback from 2 Indian cabinet ministers and other BJP functionaries against them 2 days after the Modi visit. So, just below the surface, there's a lot of anti-Americanism. And it's partly colonialism, America being the successor to, another big Western state that bullies other countries, quote unquote, and all of that. So, it's mixed up with India's colonial legacy and anti-Westernism. It's related to a robust sense of India wanting to be, its own player and count for something in the world as a great civilization. And its sense that it's been historically demeaned by Western countries, including the Americans, and so on. So, there's a whole reservoir of. Having said that, I mean, the last 20 years have seen a softening of Indian opinion towards the United States. There's a diaspora there, so there are all kinds of social links to the United States. For all the criticism of the Indian elite, of America, all their children sort of are going to study in the United States and hanker after a green card there. So, a lot of contradictions and posturings and bad faith in a lot of these statements. But on the whole, there's been an improved view of the United States. But I would caution again, it won't take much for that opinion to flip into outright public anti-Americanism. If the Americans were to do something different with Pakistan tomorrow, or start inclining towards China a bit more, I mean, things could change quite a bit. So there'll always be in India, an ambivalence towards Western countries, and particularly the United States, because it's the leading Western country. A view that it's a neo-imperialist power and that it is unreliable and often demeaning of India. So I think, that's something that the United States has to be aware of. I think Indian decision makers also are quite aware of it and take some trouble to make sure that they're not seen in the company of Westerners too much. And I think part of the kind of restraint that India shows towards China, for instance, is that It wants to, make clear to the West and to the United States that the West should not take India for granted, that it will maintain links to China and keep its options, quote unquote, open. So I think, India plays a very careful game there, civilizationally, diplomatically, politically, militarily, of staying between China and the United States. My name is Kanti Bajpai, and I'm a professor of international relations at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, which is part of the National University of Singapore.
What are the reactions in Southeast Asia to Secretary Blinken's visit to China?
I think in Southeast Asia, the reaction to Blinken's visit to China is one of some relief. It suggests that there are lines of communication open between the two superpowers. Southeast Asia is very concerned about having to make a choice, a strategic choice, between the United States and China. And so this suggests that the two are prepared to reopen channels of communication and hopefully stabilize the military and diplomatic environment in this region, the larger region of East Asia, which is important for Southeast Asia as well. So I think, overall, the messaging that's come out of that meeting is that they're trying to resume business within some limits, and that's good for Southeast Asia.
How do Southeast Asian countries want the US-China relationship to progress?
There's cautious optimism, and the caution is that this might be a one-off, the meeting between Blinken and counterparts. When Secretary of Austin was in Singapore for the Shangri-La Dialogue, for instance, his Chinese counterpart refused to meet him. So that was almost simultaneous. It was a few days before Blinken went to China. So, there are contrary trends there, obviously. Blinken is welcome in Beijing, but Austin is not welcome to speak to Chinese counterparts here on the sidelines of the Shangri-La Dialogue. The Americans want to resume a more business-like relationship, but are continuing to restrict Chinese access to technology. They're stitching up relationships with a whole bunch of allies and partners who are in a position to deliver technologies such as semiconductors and so on to China. So that's another contradiction. Engaging in a dialogue in Beijing at a strategic military level, but then continuing to prosecute the competition at the economic level. And that bears on Southeast Asia, because perhaps in the short term, the problem for Southeast Asians immediately is that supply chains being disrupted because of the competition between the United States and China, and de-risking, decoupling. All of that, has implications for Southeast Asian businesses and economic decision-making. So, Southeast Asians are happy to see the resumption of some dialogue at the big grand strategic level, but they also want to see what's in the mix going forward on the economic relationship between the US and China. In a day-to-day sense, that's more pertinent than, say, a conflagration over Taiwan. And so that's why I say cautious optimism. Great that they're talking to each other, but, the real rubber hits the road on economics here. So let's see how that progresses.
Where does Singapore hope for US-China cooperation?
I think Singapore has been pretty clear where it wants US-China cooperation. Obviously, in the military security realm, one of the nightmares for Singapore and others is a conflict over Taiwan, which would draw the region in, or at least there's the very big fear that it would. Take, for example, the US-Singapore military security relationship. Would the Americans activate it and ask for port facilities or intelligence sharing, or even some kind of naval escort or R&R and repair and maintenance and so on in the instance of a conflict over Taiwan? And if they do ask, well, what is Singapore going to do, given that it has quite a strong relationship with China? And of course, we have to worry about, in Singapore, about the internal realm as well. I mean, this is a country of 70% or so ethnic Chinese. So, there's a kind of internal political, social factor that the Singapore government would have to take into account. So I think certainly a conflict in Taiwan, that's probably the biggest worry. The South China Sea these days is relatively stable. So I don't think there's such a great worry that there would be a conflict there. And in any case, the Americans are far more agnostic about what they would do in the case of a South China Sea problem. Whereas I think it's pretty clear that they would have to take some military action in the case of a Taiwan invasion or conflict. So I think the first very big problem for Singapore is what do they do in response to American requests over a Taiwan conflict. But the other, and this is again the bread and butter issue, and that's the economics. Supply chain disruption, technology spigots being turned off, technology denials, the pressures coming either from the Chinese side or the American side on whose technology and standards to adopt in, say, internet protocols or 5G and 6G and so on. I mean, these are very real concerns here. The economic issues are very central for all Southeast Asians, but particularly for small Singapore, which must be economically integrated and connected, not just to its regional partners, but to the United States and China particularly. So I think, those are the two areas where Singapore would definitely want some repairing of relationships and a kind of normalization. I think the broader issue for Singapore would be, kind of normalization also of people to people and so on, in the hope that that will condition the overall US-China relationship and not make it awkward for Chinese and Americans to visit each other. They often transit through Singapore, and they have subsidiaries or whatever here, and it just makes it awkward when visas and things become very difficult, and there's a breakdown in say university cooperation. We're right here at the Lee Kuan Yew School. If American academics who work with Singapore counterparts and so on can't go to China, or the reverse, Chinese academics who can't get to America or work in projects where American rules may apply on intellectual sharing or whatever, then all of that makes it awkward for Singapore academics and universities, I think. So, these are at least three areas where I think Singapore would be quite concerned and would want a rapprochement or a easing of tensions.
Hi, I'm Susan Thornton, and I currently work at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center as a senior fellow, but I spent almost 30 years as a career diplomat in the U.S. Foreign Service. Well, there have been some high-level meetings all along between the U.S. and China. Most recently, of course, last month, we saw a meeting between the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and Wang Yi, who is the senior-most person in the Chinese system in charge of foreign policy. That meeting was unannounced. It was held in kind of closed-door secrecy, and we found out about it only afterwards. But it was a very productive meeting, according to the participants. Before that, of course, we saw the meeting between the two presidents in last November. It was really the first time that President Biden and President Xi Jinping had a chance to meet face-to-face after the COVID-19 pandemic and since President Biden became president. Of course, they had known each other prior to that. And we've seen a couple of other meetings. Janet Yellen met with her counterpart on the margins of a G20 meeting. And so there have been some other contacts, of course, also between our embassy in China and Chinese counterparts in Beijing and also in Washington similarly, but really not the kind of tempo of meetings that we've seen in the past between the world's two biggest powers, and certainly not the tempo of meetings that you would want and expect to see between the world's two biggest powers when we have so many issues to discuss and the world is getting increasingly complicated. Well, I think there are really many reasons. I would put at the very top of the list of reasons, an exogenous act of God, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. I think people have already forgotten about the sort of traumatic effects of that period of isolation and confusion and chaos and trauma. But it really did prevent communication on many, many levels, including really undercut the kinds of communication that the US and China and other countries are used to having in person. And a lot of diplomacy has to be done in person. You can't do everything over Zoom. Of course, that's not the only reason why things have deteriorated. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, US-China relations were already in free fall. I would say that things had started to get a little bit more testy at the end of the Obama administration, as there were concerns about things like the South China Sea, things like human rights. But then, during the Trump administration, things really deteriorated sharply with the launch of President Trump's trade war against China, imposition of tariffs, and a whole range of actions that were seen by the Chinese and I think objectively were very unfriendly to China. And so I think, that in combination with the COVID-19 pandemic, then the Biden administration comes into office, inheriting this very difficult communication situation with the Chinese, and also this very hawkish policy toward China, really 180-degree change from the strategy that the US government has been employing with respect to China over the last 4 decades. So, and dealing with a lot of other crises actually when they came into office at the same time. So I think there are a lot of reasons why the communication has fallen off so sharply. But I personally would want to put COVID-19 at the top of the stack of reasons. Yeah, it's a great question. We haven't had a Secretary of State go to China for almost 5 years, which is kind of incredible. Since 1979, we really haven't seen anything like this kind of a hiatus in our diplomatic communications by our sort of top diplomats. There are a lot of reasons and idiosyncratic situations that gave rise to this hiatus, but I think, going there for the first time in 5 years, there's a lot about China now that we don't know, that will be unfamiliar. There's a lot of things that have changed in China that we haven't really caught up with, I think, on an official basis in the US government. And so I think it's very important symbolically for our top diplomat to go to China. Their diplomats have come to the US on multiple occasions since we've been there. So just from a protocol perspective, it's extremely important in terms of conducting diplomacy that visits be regular back and forth. But I also think we've gotten into a pattern with the Chinese where meetings produce bad outcomes and negative actions on both sides. And meetings have been sort of played up in the politics in both countries, so that the stakes of even just meeting, never mind what you're going to talk about or try to achieve, has been overblown. And there's been sort of huge expectations put on just the mere fact of getting together, which is making it more difficult to conduct diplomacy between the two. And I hope that this visit, first one in 5 years, of course, it's going to be unusual and it's going to be freighted, but I hope it can start a more regular cadence of diplomacy, which I think any reasonable person, no matter how you feel about China or what you think about our policy toward China, would say that the US and China, as the two biggest countries in the world, most powerful countries in the world, having a lot of responsibilities for global structures and global governance and public goods, need to be talking on a regular basis, no matter how they feel about each other. And it's just a level of maturity that we're going to have to expect from these big powers and that they're going to have to display. And I hope that Secretary Blinken's trip can manage to convey to the world that these are two countries that, even though they don't see eye to eye on a lot of things, can conduct professional business together. Yeah, I do think, as I said in my last statement, that just conveying that kind of ability to conduct professional diplomacy is very important. And it's not just important for the US and China, it's important for the whole world. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the world is facing a lot of very complicated challenges, and we are going to face unprecedented kind of challenges and dangers in the coming couple of decades. In my opinion, most of those very serious and urgent challenges are going to come from transnational issues, not from nation state threats. Although, of course, nation state threats are all top of mind now in the wake of Russia's Ukraine invasion. But I do think that that is going to be looked upon in hindsight as more of a anomaly than, a common thread that's going to continue to plague us going forward in the coming decades. I think transnational issues, climate change, pandemics, the advent of uncontrolled new technologies that are going to be quite difficult to manage, and other kinds of things like migration, et cetera, are going to really be the biggest problems that we're going to have to face. And we're going to have to we're not going to be able to face them as one country. We're going to have to work together with other countries. And I think the US and China will have to find a way to get together on these things. So that's how I see things evolving over the medium term. But in the short term, I think it would be a success if Secretary Blinken's visit can usher in some discussion about the need to promote stability in the global system, and how are the US and China going to work to shore up the confidence in global institutions, in global governance, and in nation state governance for that matter. I mean, I think that the capabilities of governments to manage problems is seen to be eroding by many people. And so I think countries like China and the US need to work together to shore up confidence among their populations and the global population that governments can handle problems. So I hope, that sounds very abstract, but I hope that that kind of air is what can be projected coming out of this meeting. I'm sure they'll talk about specific problems. We have a lot of tensions right now in the Taiwan Strait, and any kind of conflict there would, of course, be catastrophic. So hopefully we can have some good discussions and have better understanding over those issues, at least. Also, the war in Ukraine obviously needs to be tackled in some form or fashion. We need to get to some kind of end of the fighting and onto a political settlement discussions, and hopefully they'll talk about that. But I think, and there are a number of other issues they'll discuss. I don't expect them to resolve any of those issues, obviously, but just a professional and kind of constructive conversation about these issues would be excellent, in my view.
Well, the benefits are multiple, and most prominently from my research, a lot of students almost reach the consensus that they really, really appreciate the multiple perspectives that American higher education has been able to cultivate. And the result is their critical thinking skills are very much practiced and cultivated in the United States as well. So that's a major benefit. They really appreciate the open conversation, the debate, the multiple perspectives students can openly express. And so that's the academic realm. And they also very much appreciate this very equal relationship between faculty and students.
something that is quite lacking in their prior system, where there is more of a teacher-centered, a hierarchical relationship between student and teachers. So the flaws, not so sure whether it's the flaws of the American system per se, but definitely the party culture that in American higher education has very much marginalized Chinese students, and a lot of Chinese students do not really feel a sense of belonging in the dominant party scene. As a sociologist of education myself, I know that there is a literature of American higher education that really shows not only international students, like Chinese students, find it very marginalized and sort of exclusionary, but also domestic students, especially racial minority students and first-generation college students, also find the party culture very alienating. And that is something, probably the flaws of American higher education, that really stands in the way of a good social experience of Chinese students. Definitely, the impact is quite chilling. And I would say that Chinese students often find themselves caught in the political crossfire between the escalating US-China tensions. So that really, again, applies to both their academic and social experiences. As we all know that these kinds of US-China bilateral tensions have translated into pretty negative American public attitudes towards China. I think if you look at the Pew Research report, the percentage of American public's negative attitudes towards China has increasingly risen over to 80%. I think most recent data shows is 80 to 83%. And that negative attitude towards China has also translated into their negative attitudes towards Chinese students. While most of the American public are welcoming international students, over half of them do not really think we should have Chinese students. So that, Chinese students may not really be aware of the exact statistics. They can read the media articles, they can sense, they're aware that American public are not positive about China and about them. So that really sent a very chilling message to them. And for prospective students, I think the effect probably is even more severe, that a lot of students have decided not to come to the United States. They have decided that America is not really welcoming them anymore, despite Biden administration's more explicit message of showing otherwise. You can see that in 2022, the number of visas have been really cut in half. That really shows the decreasing interest of prospective students from China in American higher education. I think the API inclusion is extremely important, as we can all see that anti-Asian racism has been conspicuously on the rise since the COVID-19 pandemic. But even before that, anti-Asian racism is there. The problem is not just on the American college campuses, but in American public in general, the awareness of anti-Asian racism is not at all there. And scholarship of Asian American students already show that even themselves are not as open or comfortable talking about racism they have experienced. So I think American university or college education broadly, what they can do is really through education to raise more awareness, through promoting and encouraging more conversations and more resources to stimulate those conversations about API history, API community issues, and how to really be a better ally, how to really a protest against anti-Asian racism, those kinds of conversations put in the open, that is really a very important mission that Asian American higher education can do. And as a director of Asian American Studies program, I know that we don't really have a lot of our programs, and I'm proud that Syracuse University has it, and we have resources to sponsor events out of our program, but we should have as many of those programs in major American universities and colleges, so that we can have platforms to reward and resource those kinds of open conversations and educate our community about this. Personally, I think this is very much related to what I said about the university. As a faculty member, I think AAPI month is a recognition of the history of AAPI community. It also provides, the sense of belonging through various kinds of forums and conversations by bringing, like, for example, our university, by bringing external speakers, by promoting AAPI Heritage Month book series. These all are going to really promote the sense of belonging for Asian American students on campus, and for myself as well.
It is indeed very troubling and sobering for our study to show that nearly 3/4 of Chinese Americans experienced some form of racial discrimination and racism-related vigilance in the past 12 months. We asked the people about different forms of such experiences. These include, for example, over half felt that they were treated unfairly in restaurants or other places. They felt that people were looking at them. And over a quarter said they've experienced direct attacks or harassment and other kinds of hate crimes. This is a big issue, but the main two consequences we see is, one, they put a lot of mental burden on the Chinese Americans. People worry about going out. They constantly worry about the safety for themselves and their family members. They try to change their travel routes. They try to avoid certain social situations. So this is a big burden that people have to face, and you can imagine how much risk this put people onto mental illness. The other consequence is the economic consequence. Many people said they have to change their work schedule, or they have to avoid some social functions so that they will lose out economically. We also have people tell us that they have to now, instead of taking public transportation, they have to take a cab. So those are costly to people. So we want to remind people that racial discrimination is hurtful, and they will bring both mental health burdens and economic consequences for our community. There are many misconceptions about the Chinese American community. And part of our motivation to do this study is to debunk these misconceptions using data and evidence. So I will give you two examples. One, our survey results show that Chinese Americans are active political participants, which is something people don't know so much about. Our findings show that 83% of Chinese American citizens are registered voters, a very high percentage. And among those, 91% actually showed up to vote in the 2020 presidential election. So this is a major voting bloc that no party should ignore. Another misconception is that Chinese Americans are homogeneous. They are doing well. They are the so-called model minority, and that's not true. We show that through our data, nearly a quarter of the sample experienced some kind of medical or economic hardship. These include having a difficulty paying bills, worrying about running out of food, and delaying medical care. That's very significant, and that's not something people know about. Another finding is that nearly 10% of this population experience one or more kinds of disability, including physical, mental, or developmental disability. Again, we need people to know about these facts, because only if we know, we can bring the services and policies to meet their needs. Diversity is important in any community, simply because every voice is important and everybody's lived experiences are important. That's also true for the Chinese American community. For example, our study shows that among Chinese Americans, nearly 40% speak more than one language at home. How amazing is that? This is the power of diversity. And this also has implications for cultural identity, civic engagement, access to services. So we want to showcase and name that diversity so that we can celebrate the power of diversity. We know that the diverse Chinese American population have made many contributions to American society, and they will continue to do so if we give them the opportunity and recognize their contributions. Policy making at its best is to respect people's rights and meet people's needs. And we know that some groups are more influential in policy making than some others. In history, a lot of marginalized groups have been trying very hard to make their voices heard, to influence policy, and Chinese Americans is one of those groups. So it's important through our survey to reveal what their needs are, what their demands are, so that policies can meet their needs. Services that are accessible, that are culturally competent, can be brought to this community, especially those who may be subject to more disadvantages within the community. For example, those with limited language ability or those with lower income. We can bring the resources and policies to them so that they are lifted up along with the others. AAPI Heritage Month, May, always brings a lot of pride and joy to me. The reason I undertook this research project, the National Survey of Chinese Americans, is because not only I feel the honor to do it, I also feel the responsibility that I should take up this project to tell the world who we are, our contributions, and our needs. For too long, the AAPI community has been marginalized, that our voices are not heard. We're kept invisible. But I think that needs to change. And May is the perfect month for us to tell our stories and build alliance so that the future can be more inclusive and more just. We will have the month ahead and years ahead to share our findings from the survey project with the community members and different organizations, policymakers, so that what we learned from our valuable, wonderful study participants can be known to the world. I also want to say that we need to tell our stories and celebrate our diverse and rich cultures, identities, and experiences in the other 11 months of the year. Who we are, what we think, what we want, how we want to change the world, all these matter every day of the year. So I encourage all of us to speak up so that our pursuits can be achieved and we can join hands with other communities to make America and the world a better place. Thank you.
One of the most pressing concerns in water protection and conservation today is the increasing water scarcity and stress caused by climate change, population growth, and unsustainable water use practices. The water crisis threatens human health, ecosystems, and economic development, particularly in water insecurity regions. Climate change is affecting water sources worldwide. As the rising temperature and changing the availability and distribution of water, melting glacier and ice caps cause sea level to rise, result in saltwater intrusion into freshwater sources, making them unusable for human consumption and agriculture. Additionally, more frequent and intense extreme weather events, such as floods, hurricanes, and droughts, can damage infrastructure, disrupt water supply systems, and compromise drinking water quality. According to UNICEF, 74% of natural disasters between 2001 and 2018 were water-related, including droughts and floods. The frequency and intensity of these events are increasing, further exacerbating water scarcity and contamination. Climate change is a significant driver of the global water crisis. Addressing it is critical to ensure sustainable water management and access to clean and safe water. Proper water management practices can help mitigate the effects of climate change on water resources and prevent the ongoing water crisis. In the last decade, public awareness of environmental protection in China has increased due to the air pollution, more frequent extreme weather events, and the COVID-19 pandemic highlighting the relationship between human beings and the nature. Since China announced its objective of achieving carbon neutrality at 2020, the environment has become a quite popular topic in China. The Chinese government has implemented various measures to promote a more environmentally friendly lifestyle in recent years. In 2019, China released the Zero Waste Plan, which included advocating for a clean plate campaign and introducing forced community waste classification. These measures have directly impacted urban citizens' lives and made household garbage a daily topic. Additionally, the bike-sharing industry has gained popularity, which contribute to reducing carbon emissions significantly. However, there is still a long way to go from recognizing environmental problems to taking action on proactively changing lifestyles. For example, China's food delivery market has grown nearly 40-fold in the last decade, with more than half of internet users in China using online food delivery services as of the end of 2021. Fast developed food delivery industry has led to the use of large amounts of single-use plastic, creating another environmental problem that needs to be addressed. China's environmental water quality increased significantly in the last decade. According to China's annual environmental reports, the proportion of surface water with good and excellent quality increased by more than 20% from 2015 to 2022, which means the drinkable surface water in China reached almost 90%. China has implemented several schemes to improve the quality and protection of its water resources, including stricter regulations, promoting public participation, and increasing investment in water treatment infrastructure. In the last decade, China has shifted the responsibility of water quality management from simply reducing wastewater discharges to a more comprehensive approach focusing on regional water resource management. By the river chef system, local government officials are assigned as river chefs responsible for coordinating efforts to improve water quality. This system has helped increase accountability and address water quality issues locally. Public participation has been crucial in driving water quality improvement in China. The government has encouraged citizens' involvement in environmental monitoring and reporting by establishing various channels for citizens to report water pollution incidents and severe polluted waterways. Social media platforms have also raised public awareness and mobilized citizens to take action on environmental issues. For example, The Chinese government has launched the Black and Others Water Treatment Campaign to encourage citizens to report severely polluted waterways through specific social media channels. Infrastructure plays an essential role in water resource management. China's investment in water treatment infrastructure has been increasing steadily. According to data from China Water Risk, China's spending on urban water supply and wastewater treatment has increased from around 90 billion yuan in 2006 to 550 billion yuan in 2020. These approaches could also be valuable for improving water quality and protection in other countries.
Through China's Clean Air Action Plan, China managed to bring the massive expansion of its coal consumption to a sudden halt. From 2000 to 2011, in just this about more than a decade of time, China's coal consumption got tripled, and of course with a significant expansion of our carbon emission. But through the clean air efforts, that trend has been stopped, and China's coal consumption more or less stabilized. And I think that was a major contribution by itself. But that was obviously not enough, because we're still consuming half of the world's coal, and our carbon emission is more than 10 billion tons, and roughly about 1/3 of the global total. So we're by far the largest current greenhouse gas emitter. China understands its responsibility and made a carbon peak and neutrality pledge in 2020, and try to peak our carbon emission by 2030, and then try to completely neutralize this more than 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide by 2060. And I think China's efforts to do this have motivated more countries to follow, and so far we're very happy to see more than 130 countries and regions have made commitments on carbon neutrality. And then today, I think we're facing a real big challenge globally. The challenge of climate change looms large, and the gap of emission reduction is actually widening instead of being closed. So I think we are ready to work with other countries to solve the problem. Yeah, the United States have been through the industrialization and urbanization much earlier than China, and during the 1960s and 70s, it was hit by suffered from also water and air pollution, and through that process have created some of the real important mechanisms to deal with to address the pollution problem. So I myself and many of my colleagues back in China, working on environmental protection, have all been benefited through all these years to learn from some of the best practices developed in America. From the environmental legislation, Clean Air, Clean Water Act, and to the market-based solutions like the cap-and-treat market, and then to the very issue of transparency. It was the toxic inventory developed in America that gave me inspiration to develop our transparency program in China. So we we have learned so much from America all these years, very much benefited. Of course, during this process, China have also managed to develop our own models, practical solutions to deal with the problem, an environmental problem, particularly, as a developing country, and we managed to take advantage of the enormous progress made in the development of IT technologies. In America, it was kind of the 70s and 80s, that era. There was not much IT, the different era. But in China, we managed to take advantage of the internet and then mobile internet and then of course big data and AI and try to use that to help enhance the efficiency and cut the cost in our pollution control, and try to use that to engage more stakeholders in our practice. And I think some of my American, U.S. colleagues were surprised to see the massive real-time disclosure of the automatic monitoring that can be done in China. Just like in many other parts of the world, we can see that along with the rising of the concentration in the atmosphere of the greenhouse gases, our temperature is going up, and along with that, there will be the rise of the sea level and all of this long-term impact. But extreme weather already cause a lot of impact in China. Last year in 2022, we suffered a historical extreme heat wave, and in some of the in quite a few parts along in the Yangtze River Valley, the temperature have reached 45 Celsius degree, and in some regions higher than that. And then during the monsoon season, we have seen a significant reduction of rainfall, which caused the troubles not just to the water supply, but also causing a lot of difficulties in our local power grid, which depend so much on the hydropower, so climate change is making its impact in China, just like in many other parts of the world. And we're now working to try to peak and neutralize our carbon emission as a country which is still trying to, going through this industrialization and urbanization. That's fundamentally is our challenge. So now, the solution is to try to synergize our fighting against climate change with the local pollution control, and try to strike these two targets together.
The United States and China together are responsible for around 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But the impacts of climate change are global, and they disproportionately affect some countries more than others. More climate emissions means more warming, which translates into increased droughts, floods, heat waves, species and biodiversity loss, and all of these impacts affect poorer nations in the global south more acutely, since they are typically located in warmer climates to begin with, compared to countries in the global north, which are more temperate, more developed, which means that they are wealthier and able to adapt better. This imbalance and inequity is why the latest COP27 climate negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, focus so heavily on this concept of loss and damage, a financial mechanism that would require global north or industrialized countries responsible for the historic brunt of climate emissions to compensate global south countries for the impacts that they've caused. US-China collaboration on climate change and environmental issues has traditionally been viewed as a bright spot in the relationship. The two countries have had a long history of working together as the G2 in the global fight against climate, since they are the two largest present-day contributors to the problem. In fact, the G2 was credited with helping to pave the way for the 2015 Paris Agreement, the only globally inclusive climate change agreement that requires all countries, no matter if you're big, small, developed, developing, to take action on climate change. It was really a watershed agreement and incredibly momentous. And the US and China helped other nations to build confidence to get there. But tensions in other domains of the US-China relationship on trade, geopolitics, Taiwan, etc., have made the G2 relationship on climate and environmental issues rocky. So the world has realized that it can't necessarily rely on the two countries to always be perennial leaders on climate change issues. And this is really unfortunate because the two working together have much more to offer than the two working separately. But frankly, as we look towards the climate change science and the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the 6th assessment report, we know that time is running out to turn global emissions around, to get them halved by 2030 and get to net zero by 2050. And the climate cannot wait for the US and China to agree on everything. Despite the momentous progress China has made to reduce air pollution in major cities and to increase forest cover, amongst other successes, it still faces a number of environmental challenges. For one, if you read the headlines from last summer, China experienced a historic heat wave. It was the worst heat wave that China had ever experienced. I think in the world, it was the worst heat wave that any country had ever experienced. And this heat wave emphasized the need for China to work even faster to reduce its emissions and bolster alternative sources of clean energy. During that heat wave, remember, temperatures were over 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and they went on for more than 70 days straight. And it affected a region as wide as 17 provinces and more than 900 million people. These heat waves not only led to high temperatures, but it also caused drought conditions and crippled China's hydroelectricity production. And remember, hydroelectricity supplies 16% of China's overall power output. Well, related to heat and water crises, coal still remains a persistent challenge for China, since it still comprises around 55% of the country's overall energy mix and generates more than 60% of its electricity. Of course, coal is the most carbon-intensive form of energy and leads to huge amounts of air pollution, and that causes 1 million premature deaths in China every year. Even though China has set a target for it to become carbon neutral by 2060, it has to eliminate coal and other fossil fuels from its electricity sector by 2050. And despite this target and the road ahead of them, they're still building more coal-fired power plants every day, and coal consumption has not seen meaningful declines since it is a cheap and readily available source of fuel. But the good news is that we have all the technologies available today in the form of renewable energy, solar and wind, and China continues to just completely crush benchmarks that it set for itself to continue to install these sources of renewable electricity. And of course, we know that China has been instrumental in making these technologies more affordable and cheaper than conventional fuels for countries across the world.
Hi, I'm Joanna Lewis. I'm Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Energy Environment and Director of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs Program at Georgetown University. I think that US competition with China has in many ways been a mobilizing force for the United States policy on climate change and particularly in clean energy technology development. Of course, the most important climate legislation that we've seen in recent history is the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which includes all sorts of programs to incentivize the development of clean energy technologies here in the United States. And we've already seen a movement towards building new clean energy technology manufacturing facilities here in the United States in response to the subsidies and incentives that this legislation provides. I think in many ways, this legislation wouldn't have happened without recognition that the United States in many ways is sort of falling behind China in the clean energy technology manufacturing space, with repercussions also for our positioning in clean energy technology innovation more broadly. And so I think that in some ways, it's been useful to have competition with China really incentivize climate action and clean energy technology innovation support here in the United States. China leads the world in the manufacturing and deployment of almost every clean energy technology that you could think of. Wind turbines, solar panels, batteries, electric vehicles, and the list goes on. But I think that, as China has developed these industries quite rapidly, there have been real investments made in the scaling of these technologies, as well as in clean energy innovation. And I think that it remains to be seen whether China is going to sort of not just be the scaler of existing technologies, or whether it has the ability to really innovate in the next generation of clean energy technologies that we're going to need for the low carbon transition. Historically, the technologies that China has really been able to adopt were initially innovated in other countries, primarily Europe and the United States, including the wind turbine and particularly solar photovoltaic technology. China was able to have that technology transferred and then really scale up manufacturing at home. And so I think the true test of China's national innovation system in the clean energy and climate space will be if we see new innovations coming out of China, particularly in the next generation clean energy technology industries that are going to be, increasingly important in the coming years as countries all over the world scale up their deployment of low carbon technologies. Climate change remains a high-level policy goal for the Chinese leadership. We still see a mention of commitment to achieving the key climate change goals that have been laid out, particularly under the Paris Agreement. China has a set of goals for 2030, including peaking emissions no later than that year, as well as a goal of achieving carbon neutrality by 2060. These so-called dual goals are really the cornerstone of China's climate policy. And while they remain very important in China's overall national policy trajectory, we have seen somewhat of a reversal in China's shift away from coal, and in fact, a return to coal in the last year, particularly coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then with the war in the Ukraine. Concerns about energy security have certainly permeated China's leadership, and we see new incentives to build coal plants and to mine coal, even if it doesn't necessarily make economic sense to do so. I think a lot of this is just a return to kind of conventional tried and true technologies in a time of crisis. But I think in order, of course, to be able to achieve the 2030 and especially the 2060 goal, this is going to require a much more concerted effort to shift away from fossil fuels and coal in particular. And we still see many signs that China's leadership is committed to this low carbon transition and to carbon neutrality goals sometime after mid-century. Happy Earth Month. Thank you, everyone.
So, this question of spying between the United States and China obviously has gotten a lot of attention recently. And it turns out it has a very long tail when you look back at the history of intelligence and espionage. And in particular, for the whole first period of US-China relations, from 1949, when the PRC is established, all the way up until finally Richard Nixon's visit in 1972. I mean, that first period is almost defined by the covert relationship, including a lot of spying, mostly America spying on China, simply because the two governments don't acknowledge one another. So it's almost, by definition, sort of a covert relationship. And I explored a lot of that in my book. If we jump to the next period after 1972, there's this incredible reversal where actually, especially look at the 1970s and through the 1980s, there's quite a bit of intelligence sharing. Henry Kissinger really uses intelligence sharing, and he's reciprocated by Zhou Enlai as a way to quickly create trust between the two countries. So there's a dramatic 180-degree reversal of the dynamics. I think if we look at the more recent period, everything's gotten a lot more complicated, and I do think we've sort of reverted back to something a little bit closer to the early days in terms of now both sides spying on one another and worrying about the espionage. So it's something that's probably a little bit understudied, but a very important part of the history between the United States and China. It was fascinating to watch the American public be transfixed by this balloon. And it's literally the bright, shiny object that's hard to ignore. And one can certainly understand why there was so much public fascination, fueled, I think, by a lot of media coverage. So, I'm not sure actually if the spy balloon is significant in terms of intelligence gathering. And actually, according to the US government, the balloon wasn't adding much in terms of what China can see with its satellite espionage capabilities. So I think that the balloon and its significance, and over time, I think the way that we'll look back upon it is it's more about public attitudes in the United States and just the way in which the American public has become so much more concerned with what China is up to in the world, and even feeling sort of watched, and obviously bristling against that, maybe to excess in this particular case. So I think it's the public reaction that's going to be the most significant part of the whole spy balloon episode in US-China relations. I don't think Americans need to stay up late at night worrying about balloons. I think there was a little bit of an overreaction to that particular form, almost old school form of espionage. And a lot of intelligence, I think publics, and in particular democratic societies like the United States, they need to be careful not to overreact. There's a understandable tendency to get too worried about spying. At the end of the day, actually, countries need to know about one another. And there's a certain amount of intelligence gathering, so long as it's not hurting anyone, that all countries are involved in. And it's not necessarily destabilizing. So you need to know where sort of the lines are. And then, of course, you need relationships among the governments when there's a feeling that the other side has really crossed the line, that there are mechanisms, to enforce limits on how far it goes. So I think that it's right that Americans are concerned about this and bring it more into the public conversation. But we also need to modulate, some of those concerns and be careful not to overreact. So it's kind of the Goldilocks principle. You have to find that golden mean where you are recognizing that dynamics are changing and that Americans do need to be concerned about this, but not to the point of overreaction.
I would say the general trend is really one of slowdown. First, as a country gets richer, it becomes more difficult to maintain high growth. At China's current GDP per capita level, it is impossible to maintain growth at about 6%. Moreover, China faces another two headwinds. First is the worsening of demographics. Because of the one-child policies, China will face rapid aging in the coming years. Moreover, the recent tension in US-China relationships means China will find it difficult to access cutting-edge Western technology, such as semiconductor manufacturing, which further set back China's effort to become an advanced economy. I would name three. First is trade surplus. In China's case, China used to run very large trade surplus. For example, in the years before the financial crisis, trade surplus almost accounted 10% of China's GDP. The second indicator is consumption. This is because for many years, China has relied on investment to create growth, but investment without consumption is not sustainable. As a result, we want to see consumption-driven instead of investment-driven growth. The third factor is household income. As long as households are not comfortable with their income growth or financial situation, they will not spend a lot of money and instead will save the money, which means without household income growth, it is impossible to achieve strong consumption growth. I would say at this moment, there are two major challenges for the Chinese economy. First is COVID. Because China continued to implement zero-COVID policies, travel, transportation, and services sectors has been severely impacted, and especially the impact on services sector is very concerning. This is because right now, services sector generates the majority of the jobs. Because services sector, such as restaurant and tourism, has been severely affected by the zero-COVID. This means that a lot of people who work in those sectors, they're suffering large income jobs, and many of them probably lost their jobs. Both the income drop and the high unemployment rate are both bad for consumption. The second challenge is property. Property is the biggest and most important sector for the Chinese economy, including its upstream and downstream sectors. Together, they account for close to 20% of China's economy. Yet, property sale has declined significantly in recent months. Through the month of July, property sale has declined more than 25% year on year. And the reason of this decline can be attributed to two factors. One is households are less confident in their abilities to purchase property. This is because as the economy slows down, households suddenly realize their income is now growing much slower than they anticipated. Moreover, because in China, the majority of the property sales are in the form of pre-sale, which means households need to first make down payments, usually 1 or 2 years in advance. Recently, many large property developers have defaulted on their debt, and the financial difficulties affect developers' ability to deliver their pre-sale units on time. As a result of those two challenges, households are becoming more reluctant to purchase property. And the property problem is concerning not only because of its impact on growth, but more importantly, it also has financial implications. This is because Chinese banks not only have direct exposures in the form of mortgages or lending to developer or construction firm. More importantly, because of a slowdown in property sale, developers are now less willing to purchase land, and land is Chinese local government's biggest source of income. With land sales now also down close to 30% year on year, local governments are now having difficulties to repay their debt, which will have severe financial risk implication. A slowing, weaker Chinese economy affected the rest of the world, including United States, through multiple important channels. Number one will be trade. As China's economy slows down, naturally this means Chinese demand for goods from other countries will also decline. Less Chinese import means less income for other countries. For example, in the case of the United States, currently the United States export close to $150 billion worth of goods to China. And the number two channel of how Chinese slowdown will spill over to the rest of the world is the exchange rate. With Chinese growth slowdown, the Chinese RMB will depreciate. A depreciation of RMB means appreciation of other currencies, for example, the US dollars. If US dollars become more expensive relative to RMB, this means that US goods are becoming less competitive, and this also means US goods may lose some of its market share due to competition from cheaper Chinese goods. The number three channels is financial linkages. Basically, concern about Chinese slowdowns and the uncertainty about the potential implications may trigger so-called risk-off sellings in the financial market. For example, during the last time China's growth slowed down significantly, which was 2015 to 2016, US stock market has also declined because of concerns about China's hard landing.
So Xi Jinping is the political leader of China. Among all the positions he's holding, he's probably holding dozens of positions right now, but there are three that are the most important. First, he's the president of China. This means that he's the head of the state. He gets to meet with other heads of state, for example, Queen Elizabeth or the president of the United States. But in China, this is a symbolic position, which doesn't come with a lot of power. Second, he's the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party. This means that he's the boss of the party. This is more powerful than, for example, his counterpart in the US, which, for example, is the chair of the Republican National Committee, which doesn't have a lot of power. But in China, if you are the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, you get to make decisions not only for the party, but also for the whole country. The third position, which is the most powerful among all, is the chairman of the Central Military Affairs Commission. This means that he's the commander-in-chief in China, who is in charge of China's military. In addition to these formal positions, he's also a princeling, which means that he's the son of one of the founding fathers of the People's Republic of China. His father, Xi Zhongxun, was a colleague of Mao Zedong's and also a high-ranking official in the 1950s, 1960s. So Xi Jinping has this formal power coming from his formal positions, but also he has this charisma, his legacy from his father, who was one of the founders. So a popular view is that Xi is a dictator who moves his fingers and things get done in China, but that's actually not true. I'm going to make a bold argument here that he's actually not as powerful as we think he is. We often associate power with formal positions, but that has not been the case in Chinese politics. Deng Xiaoping, for example, who was the leader of China in the 1980s, didn't hold the same positions that Xi Jinping is holding. For example, Deng was never the president of China. Deng was never the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party. So you cannot really measure how much power a person has by looking at his formal positions. We political scientists often consider power to have three phases. We have three phases of power. The first is decision-making power. So who gets to make decisions? For example, how much money we should allocate to infrastructure rather than education, things like that. The second phase of power is so-called agenda setting power. That is, we get to decide what decisions get to made. For example, during a meeting, what are the items on the agenda that we can make decisions on? This is the second phase of power. If you can make the agenda, you have a lot of power. But then the really important phase of power, which is the third phase of power, is about thought control. That is, you can influence how people think. And then if you have this phase of power, you have the third phase of power, you can influence how people think. You don't even need the first two phases of power. You don't need to make decisions. You don't need to set the agenda. You can just simply influence how people think, right? So that's the most important phase of power we political scientists care about. So in a sense, say for example, a lot of people compare Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping and think that Xi is more powerful than Mao Zedong. But I would make the counter argument that Mao actually has the third phase of power, that during the Cultural Revolution, during the whole Mao era, I would say Mao could really influence how Chinese people think. During the Cultural Revolution, people followed him, voluntarily, to become Red Guards, for example. And then, and people were voluntarily doing this, not because of fear. It's actually because they believed in Mao. They believe in Maoism. They believe that Mao is a good leader who can lead China to a better future. But I would say that Xi Jinping doesn't have that power, right? I think most of the times in contemporary China, Xi makes people comply by creating fear. It's not that people are following him voluntarily. It's actually people following him because people worry about the risks of not following him, right? And then, say for example, during his anti-corruption campaign, he arrested a lot of high-ranking officials, which created this fear among all the bureaucrats in the whole political system. And then people, changed their behavior because of fear created during the anti-corruption campaign, not because people voluntarily follow what Xi Jinping tells them to do. And it might have reduced corruption in the Chinese government, but we don't really know whether it will last once the fear is gone. And then one limitation of using fear is that you never know whether people are truly loyal to you, right? They're now loyal to you on the surface. Xi appears to have no political opponents, at least publicly, but the officials all appear to be loyal and compliant, but they might be hiding their true feelings, right? So I think it's very important to understand it's not only about what you look on the surface, how powerful you are, whether you can make decisions. It's also about whether you can shape how people think. I don't think there will be a big event that lead to the collapse of the Chinese Communist Party. I don't think that will happen in the near future. But I think that in the next, let's say 5 or 10 years, if Xi Jinping is still in power, let's say in the next 5 or 10 years, one sign that his power is declining is we see more policy changes or policy shifts within a very short period of time, right? We in the past several years that he has been trying to push for certain policies, but we are maybe in the next 5 or 10 years we are likely to change his policies, where there's some discussion, public discussions that question the policies that he made in the past 10 years. So I think those are probably the signs that his power is declining. Also a sign that there are disagreements within the party, but that's still very unlikely, I think, because Xi has accumulated so much power within the Chinese Communist Party, and then like I said, everybody is quiet because there is this fear. One difference between Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un is that Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, created the Workers' Party of Korea. This is the ruling party in North Korea right now. So which means that the legitimacy of the Kim family predated the legitimacy of the ruling party in Korea. And then you can imagine that, for example, if the Kim family is gone, North Korea might collapse, because the whole legitimacy of the regime really depends on the legitimacy of the Kim family. But this is not the case for Xi Jinping or the Chinese Communist Party. Xi's family, even though his father was one of the founding fathers of the People's Republic of China, but he didn't create the party like Kim Il-sung did. So therefore, the power of the Xi family, or the power of Xi Jinping himself, really comes from the party. The party has the legitimacy. People support the party, and then they support whoever controls the party. So therefore, if you say, for example, if Xi Jinping is gone, or the Xi family is gone, I would imagine that the Chinese Communist Party will still be there, in China, ruling China, because the legitimacy of the party is still elected Xi Jinping himself. And then when it comes to Putin, it's very interesting that both are in the popular view, both are dictators who have a lot of power. But actually, if you look at what they did, they both follow the rules, right? In Putin's case, he had to step down because the constitution had term limits. So he had to step down to become the prime minister, and then he comes back to become the president. For Xi Jinping, because the constitution has term limits for the presidency, he had to change the constitution. Although it's this is a manifestation of power, but then he had to follow the rules. He had to change the constitution so that he can follow the rules. When he abolished term limits, now he can forever. Some of them actually follow the rules, so that's very interesting, which is very counterintuitive when we think about them as powerful dictators. He can rule for life, but it doesn't mean that he will. If I were Xi Jinping, I would never become Xi Jinping. But if I were the top leader in China and then there's no term limits, the best way for me and for my legacies to continue is actually when I'm healthy, when I'm relatively younger, I would choose someone that I trust completely and then make that person my heir apparent and then make sure that he or she, I hope it's a she, but it's not very likely in Chinese politics, my parent will carry my legacies, right? So I think that would be the best scenario for Xi Jinping. So which means that, if he really cares about his legacies, he will step down earlier and then choose his heir apparent to make sure that the heir apparent will continue his policies.
Communism means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but it's a type of political economic system in which there is quote unquote public ownership of the means of production, which typically means that the state stands for all the people in owning things like money, factories, firms of all kinds, instead of having private ownership over the means of production. Communism also has a kind of political element in that it's typically represented by communist parties, which tend to not participate in multi-party elections typically, but instead have non-democratic or authoritarian governments that govern this particular form of political economy. Well, yes and no. So, of course, there's not only state ownership over all business in China. The state does own a lot of businesses in China, and there's a lot of state influence over business in China. But in the last 40 years in China in particular, there is a vast privately owned economy. So hundreds of thousands, millions of firms that are owned not by people in the state or the government and people who have nothing to do with the state and the government, but people who are private citizens who own their own business. And so there's a huge, what we would call market economy that looks a lot like the kind of economy we have in the United States or elsewhere in China. Politically, China is still communist in the sense that it is run by the Communist Party of China, the CPC, or sometimes called the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. And they do not compete in multi-party elections, and it is an authoritarian regime in which there's no other contestant to political power in China. And so the political system is very communist in the sense that it's organized by a communist party. But the economic system is much more hybrid in that there's both state ownership in the Chinese economy and there's private ownership. The Chinese state's interaction with the non-state owned firms, so the privately owned firms, is changing all the time in China. It's always kind of been in flux and it's changing all the time. So recently, we've seen a number of changes in the Chinese economy. It used to be that private companies kind of were able to do whatever they needed to do to survive. They made their own decisions about their investments and about the kinds of businesses they participated in. But very recently, the Chinese government has taken a much stronger role in saying to private firms, especially very large ones, you can do this, you cannot do this. Nonetheless, the vast majority of Chinese firms continue to be smaller scale firms, even the ones that are producing things that, I could pick up in my room and hold in my hand here and say, this is made in China. Most of those things are made by companies that are smaller scale that continue to have nothing to do with the Chinese government itself. no. And so the Chinese Communist Party is a very large political party. It's the largest political party in the world. About 1 in every 12 Chinese citizens is a member of the party, which, if you do the math, makes for quite a large number of people. And the reasons that they join the party can be many. Some of them, believe in communism the way that we might have thought of communism 50 years ago. Others just want to be close to power. Others want to know more information about what's going on with the government. And others have idealistic ideas about how to change society, and joining the Communist Party is the only way to do it. And so they have, much different reasons from each other, from what we might think, for joining the Communist Party. It is true that a lot of people, especially even private business owners in China, are members of the Chinese Communist Party, which is kind of ironic if you think about it, being an entrepreneur and a capitalist, and yet you're a member of a communist political party. But in 2001, the CCP changed to say entrepreneurs are welcome in the party. And so so it's a big tent, as we might say, for who gets to be part of the Chinese Communist Party. But increasingly, especially under Xi Jinping, it's a narrower set of goals that the CCP actually stands for. And that could include, and is starting to include, things like common prosperity and less inequality, more equality in Chinese society, which kind of harkens back to an old definition of communism that, again, we haven't heard much about in the last 40 years. Well, the first thing I would do is note that many, many brilliant scholars of China have been incredibly wrong in the past in terms of what's going to happen in China, including very recently. If you look back at what people thought about Xi Jinping in 2013, the refrain from a lot of popular observers and scholars, including many people who were experts on China and Chinese politics, were saying he's going to be a reformer, he's going to privatize state-owned enterprises. And of course, we've seen exactly the opposite, which is a greater role for the state and a narrowing space for entrepreneurs in the private sector in China. So it's very hard to say. My view right now is that the party state in China is a little anxious, or very anxious, you might say, about things that are going on domestically and things that are going on internationally. And anxiety tends to produce a greater effort and desire for control in China, whereas being relaxed about things tends to produce some kind of liberalization. And so as long as the party state is very concerned about domestic threats, such as they perceive them in different parts of China, the threats of financial instability, or global threats, closed markets in the West, economic sanctions, and things like that, it's going to produce a greater role for the state, which can result in a kind of vicious cycle, because then the greater the role for the state, the more people outside of China distrust what's going on in China, and the more they then close access to global supply chains and things like that, which then makes the Communist Party even more anxious. My sense is that when people talk about communist China and the communist governments in China, they're trying to underscore the political distance between China's system and the system that we're familiar with in the United States, where we do have multi-party elections and we do embrace private ownership over most of the economy, right? And so it's interesting because even though China's always been communist, actually, it's never not been communist since 1949. It's been communist. The Chinese Communist Party has been in charge, for more than 70 years now. And so the entire time, right, it's been communist, but only recently have people like to call it communist China when they talk about it. And partly that's because I think many in the United States are disappointed with the direction that China has taken. They sort of thought that integrating China into global networks or investing in China or opening markets to China would somehow generate a system that looks more like our system. And it hasn't done that. Whether it was ever going to do that is beyond the scope of what I can talk about right now, but it hasn't done that. And so I think they're saying communism as a way to make sure that people know that from their view, China is a system that's very different from our system. Many Americans are very used to a kind of Cold War framing of politics. So many, especially who were, born before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union, right, are used to thinking of communism and capitalism or democracy as being fundamentally opposed to one another. And in a sense, they were, right? And partly because in the Cold War, the Soviet Union was attempting to internationalize its project of communism. So convince every country in the world that it should have a system that looked a lot like the system of the Soviet Union, which was, of course, communism. And the United States was committed to making sure every country in the world thought that it should embrace a system that looks more like capitalism and democracy, which is like the American system. It is not my view at all, and I think most people would agree, that China wants to turn anyone into looking like China. In fact, I think that if we look at most of the propaganda that the party state itself puts out, it's about China being unique, China being its own model, and it's not really available for export for a variety of reasons that have to do with China's population size, its history, its historical endowments with different things, but it doesn't want the whole world to look like China. So this idea that we necessarily have to be in conflict in China with China because of their different system. In the past, there was an ideology to that, and I think there's still ideology in both China and in the United States, but China does not have a global mission of converting every country in the world to being a system that looks like its own, far from that. And so to me, it does not seem like it's necessary to think that because China is communist and we're not communist, that kind of conflict is inevitable.
I think on a scale of 1 to 10, I would say the current US-Japan relations are something like 25. So it's way out of off the charts, and the relationship is very good. The relationship has been good since the days of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and President Donald Trump. But that relationship was very much dependent on Abe's personal relationship with Trump. I think the Biden administration has changed the dynamics of the relationship in a very positive way, in that it's more based on values and this shared view of the world and a liberal international order. So it's much more easier for Japan to get on board. The other side of that is that China has really stopped bothering to be loved by the world. So when it comes to Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, it really doesn't care what the world thinks. So that has made it much more easier for Japan to stick with Washington. But in the mid to long term, whether this honeymoon between the US and Japan will last forever, and whether Japan's strategy is correct in just teaming with America, I'm not quite sure. I think Japan thinks that we're not heading into a bipolar world, but we're heading into a world where the US-led international liberal order will be much more bigger and more powerful than China's pillar. So whether that's true, I can't say, but I think it's important for Japan and South Korea to keep their options open and to be flexible, because we really don't know which way the world is going. Japan is the world's third largest economy. It has a very powerful, especially maritime self-defense force. So you could say that it's a major country. But if you really think of the great power competition and the players taking part in that great power competition, I think they have to have a huge population, huge economy, huge military, and global ambitions. Japan doesn't really fit those. It doesn't have the population. It doesn't have the global ambitions. So we'll leave that to the US and China. So that probably makes Japan a middle power. And if you look at what's happening in the Indo-Pacific, while there is a great power competition and all these India, Australia, Japan are siding with America, underneath the surface, there is a movement of these middle powers joining hands. And what's interesting is that they're joining hands first to form a united front against China, but also I think they're preparing for the day when the next American president isn't as committed to the Indo-Pacific and isn't as caring of its allies and partners, so that if such a new American president does come into office, these middle powers would have a stable footing. Japan's economy is very much intertwined with China. We have so many manufacturers,
and recently so much more retail operators doing business in China. And the reality is that China is the source of growth for so many Japanese companies. So it's very difficult to decouple with China completely. Japan would like to have a good security relationship with America, but also have a good economic relationship with China. That looks to be very difficult to sustain going forward. I say that because if you look at the Pentagon and the things that they are worried about, I think they're worried about the Chinese chips embedded into the system in American infrastructure could be planted with malware. Now, if that's the case, then the sanctions on Huawei, for instance, are not going to go away. And America will try to build a separate, decoupled supply chain of high-tech technology. And it would request that Japan and South Korea and all its allies move to the American version of the supply chain. Now, that's going to be really difficult for Japanese companies like Tokyo Electron and all these companies, Murata, that make a bulk of their profit in China. So whether Japan decouples in the high-tech world from China is going to be a very difficult choice for Japan to make. And for Japan, if China does take over Taiwan militarily, if that happens on Wednesday, I think Japan thinks that it will come after the Senkaku Islands on Thursday and possibly come for the Okinawa Islands on Friday. So that's why the Taiwan issue is a Japanese defense issue. But when it comes to Suga's position on Taiwan, I think it's a little different from Biden's. In March, Japan and the US held a 2+2 meeting of defense and foreign ministers. In that statement, they underscored the importance of the peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. And in April, when Biden and Suga met at the White House, they added one more sentence to that. They underscored the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and encourages the peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues. So that on the surface, at first glance, it looks like they added more on Taiwan. So maybe Japan and the US toughened their stance on Taiwan. It was indeed the first time since 1969 that the US and Japanese leaders mentioned Taiwan in their joint statement. But if you look at the words that were added, it's encouraging the peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues. And I heard that Suga wanted to add this to signal that the first priority is a peaceful resolution. So I think there may be a little bit of a difference between Suga and the Pentagon on this issue. History is a very interesting aspect of the relationship. Of course, the immediate history is a very sad history, and it really tears up the relationship between the two countries. But if you go back a few centuries to the Tang Dynasty and the Nara period of Japan, relations were very good. Japan sent 20 dignitaries to the Tang Dynasty to learn about the culture and the science. Chang'an back then was the New York of today, and Japan learned so much. So I think the relationship between Japan and China was that of admiration and learning from the best. If China does become the world's dominant superpower in 2028 or 2030, and it can become like the Tang Dynasty, I think Japan will tilt towards China. But if the superpower China is an extension of what the China is today, then that's not going to happen. History tells us that Japan has not hesitated to change its alliances. In the early 20th century, Japan had an alliance with England, then it switched 180 degrees to team with Nazi Germany after the war. It tilted 180 degrees back to the US and freedom and democracy. So it has a track record that suggests that if China becomes the dominant superpower, it will have no hesitation to switch to China, but we'll see. Nikkei Asia is the English language arm of Nikkei. Nikkei is a Japanese newspaper in operation for 145 years. We want to be the go-to place for everything regarding the Indo-Pacific business, economy, and the geopolitics that influence those business decisions. We're at asia.nikkei.com. You can subscribe to us the first 3 months for 2 cups of coffee. So please give it a try.
Science fiction in China, at least in the 20th century, is really a foreign import. China has its own tradition of fantasy fiction, but this group of writers that we're looking at now actually grew up on American science fiction. Not quite counting Liu Cixin three-body problem, because he's an earlier generation who grew up during the Cultural Revolution, but the way that science fiction has developed in China since his great success with his trilogy is really the younger writers who are the one-child generation. They grew up reading American science fiction from the golden age, so on and so forth. Now, in terms of what it says about China now and why is science fiction so popular, that has not always been the case. Science fiction actually went through several waves, several points of ups and downs in the course of 20th century. It was banned on several occasions in the late 70s and early 80s under the rubric of spiritual pollution from the West. So the confluence between science fiction and China's state directive has not always been there. So it's really kind of a renegade genre that now just happens to have its spotlight because of China's drive for science and technology, which has been going on since the 50s, but now taken to new heights. That said, the most important thing for sci-fi writers is still having the room to create and to think freely without necessarily holding too closely to the state vision for science technology. But so far, so good. There seems to be a mutually beneficial relationship. One change in recent times is last August, the Chinese government put out 10 guidelines for science fiction industry. And this was quite impactful because obviously, if anything else, it confirms the fact that Chinese science fiction has caught the state's attention. But what they're interested in fostering is not just fiction per se, but the entire genre as an industry, replete with movie scripts, different forms of IP, gaming, but the big focus in these 10 guidelines is actually film industry, including training writers, screenplays, the whole mechanism of converting fiction into film, so on and so forth. We're actually at a very exciting period where we're not sure what's going to happen to Chinese science fiction in the next several years. Hopefully, our writers will just simply have the time they need to write and to create.
Sci-fi is a really interesting case within the Chinese film industry. It's been very successful domestically, so the Chinese market has really excelled and generated a lot of income through sci-fi films. For example, a recent film, The Wandering Earth, took in over $600 million in the box office domestically. Now, the interesting thing is, while there has been some interest in distributing the film globally, as well as other Chinese films, there is a hesitancy about wide global uptake of Chinese sci-fi films because a lot of them have very nationalistic themes. There is another side of this, which is that the increased robustness of the Chinese domestic film market through things like the Chinese sci-fi landscape means that the Chinese film market has more power relative to Hollywood in previous years. So there's less dependence on Hollywood studios for being able to supply key tech roles, for example, because there's an ample supply of that now within the Chinese film industry. So there is a power shift that's occurring as a result of the Chinese sci-fi industry.
When we look at the field of Chinese sci-fi and speculative fiction and how it connects to Chinese culture, society, everyday people, I think we have to think about a country's literature is not a monolith. So just like writers of any other cultural background, a Chinese writer of sci-fi or speculative fiction is not going to think of themselves as speaking for the country or culture. And while some works may touch on social critique or engage with visions of the future or shed light on China's rapid technological growth and development, I think most authors are also just trying to tell a good story. And so we have to think about their individual interests and intentions and look at this question, I think, in terms of individual authors and individual works and what do they perhaps say about Chinese society and everyday people. As Chinese speculative fiction becomes better known in English and more widely translated, there's an opportunity for it to be in conversation with and expand non-Chinese readers' understanding of not just Chinese culture or society, but also just people's understanding of the genres themselves, and to kind of shed light on what science fiction and fantasy fiction and different types of speculative fiction, what can they be, and expand the genre writing that's available in English and offer different perspectives on genre conventions and storytelling tropes. For me, as a Chinese Canadian writer and translator, I think the power of reading speculative fiction and translation is it can expose readers to fantastical worlds, imaginative situations, future possibilities that exist beyond the world we live in.